Happy Earth Day. When I was a kid, somehow I wanted to be an archaeologist. Today, I'm inviting you to join me and my guest on a dig. We're going to revisit a classic from the early days of the ecology movement, William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. As I took in his image of humans as miniature seas, I added ambulatory and crafted a riplet for today. We, ambulatory miniature seas, is your eye a whaler or a surfer? When you wade, do you leave an oil slick or gentle ripples? When you christen a ship, do you name it never enough or just enough? Do you work to take even faster, or do you find ways to give back? My guest today is Dr. Todd Rockwood, Associate Professor at the University of Minnesota's School of Public Health in the Division of Health Policy and Management. In the name of full disclosure, I'll say that 15 years ago, my company transformed a second floor space in his home to a master bedroom, and we're currently converting the kitchen, dining room, and living room into a great room. Todd, good morning.
Hi, Kel. How are you?
When we were talking yesterday, you mentioned a paper you wrote as your best work to date. What's it about, and why is it your favorite?
Well, it's very detached from something related to Earth Day, but it is associated with the response categories that we present people in a survey. And if we adjust those response categories, we can completely invert the conclusions we would draw. The hallmark of the paper, it's a paper where I spent a huge amount of time exploring the theory behind response formation and how the presentation of response categories would alter how a person interprets a question. In light of the fact that the question was worded exactly the same, the only adjustment was the response categories.
Well, I mean, isn't that a major concern of political pollsters?
Oh, it's
That
huge.
sort of thing, as far as how, I mean, that's how you create push polls, isn't it?
No, absolutely part of push polling, and it's used, it influences all kinds of things beyond polling. I mean, if we look at, rates of exercises determined through a survey, that, this adjustment of response categories could show that any given population exercises at a very high level, a very intense level. Using different response categories, we could show that the population is very lethargic, that they don't exercise. That with one of the nightmares within surveys is trying to get meaningful and accurate information. And it is very, very difficult when we are dealing with a very imprecise measurement tool.
And excuse me, why is that your favorite of all your papers?
Well, it was solidly grounded in theory. As I made the transition from sociology into public health research, they are very different arenas. Public health's a profession, focused really on a lot of pragmatic and applied things, such as, the past year. Sociology, there was the classic article in the mid 1980s in the New York Times about the declining significance of sociology. And one of the things that drives part of that is the role of theory and subscribing to theory at a level that goes beyond what's pragmatically capable. But for me, within this paper, it was reading a huge amount of cognitive psychology, which was somewhat alien to me, as well as sociological literature on normative expectations around conversations, and thinking through how those two models came together to affect the response you would get.
So it was bringing those two things together in a way that you felt, what, explanatory and compelling, was what made it so satisfying.
Yeah, I guess it's that instance where someone who works in academia is the appropriate and pragmatic application of theory to design an experiment, conduct the study, and then evaluate the responses. And oftentimes we think of research, we don't really have that opportunity often in social research. Experimentation is very difficult. Theories are very incomplete, often contradictory. So within this one instance, probably the single instance of my career where I feel I actually followed this scientific model. Most research actually doesn't subscribe to the scientific model very closely.
Well, now I have a problem,
Okay.
because I would like to follow up on that explosive statement you just, that firebomb you just threw. I'd like to pursue that. However,
Yes.
I do want to keep in mind that we want to discuss this book.
Yep.
So I do have a question for you, moving away from that.
Okay. I'm good.
Where and when did you first meet Professor Catton?
Well, I first met him in 1980. Hold on, let me think. It's I'm gonna say I first met him in the fall of 1987. I had started graduate school at Washington State University. Bill was on sabbatical for my first year, and I camped fundamentally outside of his door for the month of August, waiting for him to come back in. And my first meeting of Bill, I was sitting with my back leaning against his door, waiting, hoping he'd show up that day.
So in order for you to, forgive me, manifest stalker behavior, you must have read his books or known of him deeply for you to want to meet him.
Oh, absolutely. I first read his book when I was an undergraduate student, and a couple of immediate reactions to it. One is kind of who gives away the content of the book on the cover. And when you look at the cover of Bill's book, I mean, it fundamentally runs through, here's the story you're going to read about, carrying capacity, the cornucopian myth, drawdown, cargoism, overshoot, which is what his book is about. The book didn't really deal with crash. That's what happens after. And the first impression was a cover. This is not a normal cover for a book to give away so much of its content. And second is the first paragraph of the book. The book opens up relaying a story of a reporter in Russia in the early 1920s during a famine. And there are guards around granaries. And the local population, a fair number, have perished from famine, and many more were going to. And the reporter could not understand why they were guarding the grain in the silos. And the response from the guard was, "We don't steal from the future. That is seed for the next planting cycle." And yes, it comes at a dramatic cost to individuals at the current time, but it involves a trade-off that they were not willing to make. They are not going to rob the future to feed themselves now. And I found that notion to be quite compelling relative to thinking about, consumption and materialism within industrialized societies, that we aren't willing to forego often. That which we want today, thinking of those who will come after us in time.
Were those the two things that just sort of pulled you right in, the cover and the parable, that you just said, I got to
Yeah.
read more about this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was, those things, and just this feeling within sociology that we had wandered far away from many of the beginning points of sociology, especially American sociology. The roots of it were very closely, the dynamic between ecology, geography, and social systems was tightly woven. And I felt that was lacking as I would read contemporary sociological writing. It would be, well, what about the environment? What about resources? What are the things, within and on this planet that allows these things to happen? The root of social action is at some point extraction of resources from the environment in many ways, be it grain, or shelter, whatever we have done, that the root of all of social behavior has to begin with ecology. We, as a living being, ecology is central to my existence and central to everyone's existence.
One of the things I'd like to do now, excuse me, is wade into the actual text.
Okay.
And what I want to do is I want to read from page 218. And
Okay.
what intrigues me about this is that it draws on a commonplace experience we all have in a number of different contexts. For Professor Catton, he chose a bank.
Yeah.
And I just want to read this to set this up for some discussion, because it hits both overtly and in the background all of his major concepts. So I'll just read this, so bear with me for a moment. To understand how human social processes were being revolutionized by ecological forces, which you just mentioned, we must examine a distinctly human form of social behavior, forming cues and, with mutual restraint, taking turns. Visualize a large city bank on a busy day. Customers sometimes arrive in the bank faster than the tellers can serve them, and queues spontaneously form. Customers generally do a reasonable amount of waiting in line with reasonable patience, knowing others will similarly wait their turn to do business, and confident that the delay is no threat to the completion of the business they have in mind. Under post-exuberant conditions, that is outside of banks, that kind of faith is breaking down. To understand why, consider the quintessentially human quality of queuing behavior. It uses moral restraint to maximize the average fulfillment of self-interest. I think that is such a remarkable phrase. I want to read that again. It uses moral restraint to maximize the average fulfillment of self-interest, and it depends on cognitive comprehension of the situation and faith in reciprocity. And to me, that's the cornerstone. Faith in reciprocity is what makes civil society possible. The burly do not normally elbow their way ahead of the frail. The customer who happens to have a personal acquaintance with a teller does not normally take advantage of it. A few exceptions to strict queuing may be tolerated in recognizably special circumstances. But if there come to be too many exceptions to the normal pattern of turn taking, people will cease to infer that each exception is legitimate. Faith in the general fairness of the system gives way to doubt, and orderly queues may dissolve into a mad scramble. So, as a sociologist, as an undergraduate student, all of these people you've been, what jumps off the page when you hear that passage?
There are multiple things that jump off. One is the notion of average fairness, which is we forego our personal gain or maximization of our personal benefit with the recognition that there are going to be instances where others will do the same for us, that no one likes somebody jumping in front of them in a line. And it's the notion of fairness within a community, that we are at some level all in this together. And we have to work with one another. So, and in part, I think of multiple social issues, the notion of delayed gratification, if we look more at a consumer as opposed to a service, and the bank is certainly a service-oriented social process, that, some of the things we are looking at within this framework is who is my community and what ought to be that the norm of reciprocity, that I will treat you in accordance with how I would like to be treated, or the deference to particular segments of the population. You give up your seat to an elderly person on a bus. If you think when I grew up, it's probably still the case now, but there are certain expectations of, we like to do civil, in quotes, civil behavior, but they are core to maintaining the ability to carry on activity in a complex social environment. That, there are these fundamental rules that we don't break. And often in relief against what Catton is writing about is, think about dystopian novels you've read, that those dystopian novels often describe social systems where these kind of fundamental norms and expectations have disappeared from being part and parcel of day-to-day life.
What I'd like to do is look at two graphs
Okay.
that I think do a good job of expressing the notion of overshoot. The first one is a plot between world ecological footprint and biocapacity. And the thing that's most noticeable is that the green line represents biocapacity, and all of the red represents our world ecological footprint. And it strikes me, you tell me, that the distance between the carrying capacity, the biocapacity, carrying capacity, and our footprint is the overshoot.
Absolutely. That's the core notion of overshoot, is that load on the environment exceeds the carrying capacity of the environment, which is usually, defined as an ecosystem. that it shows this, as the graph is showing, a steady trajectory in which the load upon the environment is, increasingly overwhelming what the environment is capable of sustaining.
And the second graphic has to do with the United States,
Yeah.
which once again shows ecological footprint, biocapacity, ecological deficit, and ecological reserve.
Mhm.
And this cycles back to Catton's use of the bank metaphor, in the sense that we are living off our ecological reserves.
Yes.
In his bank metaphor, we would be consuming assets rather than income.
No, absolutely. I mean, to continue in with the banking metaphor, I mean, the part of the fundamental point of Bill's work is to bring our awareness to, as a society, like in the United States, that we are engaging in a form of deficit spending for which there is no debt relief, that we are seriously consuming far beyond what is producible within the ecosystem that we live and inhabit. This primarily occurs through multiple methods. One is takeover, which forms the fundamental tenet of Bill's work. That is, we don't live, we may live in a particular ecosystem. So for example, here, I'd never looked it up, but I looked up what ecosystem the Twin Cities is. And where the hell did I write it? Okay, because more checked it out. All right. Well, I know enough of it that it'll be close enough. That we may live in the St. Croix stagnation plane, I think is what it's called, ecosystem here. But if we think about everything that is available around us, our footprint is global. That the food we eat comes from Central America, South America, Australia. Other things come from Europe. We fundamentally live in this country that our footprint invades every continent on Earth except for maybe Antarctica. That otherwise there isn't a place that isn't local for me relative to consumption.
Right. Now,
That-
footprint.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think the professor's spirit will smile at this. Excuse me. A Catton coinage was Homo colossus. And in his mind, we had evolved, have I got this right, from Homo sapiens to Homo colossus.
Yes.
Now, in honor of Earth Day, it occurred to me to cycle back to my high school Latin, and I want to offer this as an alternative of what we need to become: Homo doratum, which could be translated as man or humans the sustainer. So do you think the good professor would smile at that, or would he scoff or puke, or what would his response be?
He would smile. He would definitely smile. That Bill, Bill gave a very dire message, and was relaying a very dire message. But that message is founded on his academic work and looking at data and looking at the principles of exchange between social systems and ecosystems. And Bill was very pessimistic. That's the final term on Overshoot is crash. On the cover of the book is crash, which is fundamentally a die-off and we're not talking a minor die-off, we're talking a cataclysmic die-off of a population. In class and in conversations, he would constantly talk about yeast in wine vats and the ultimate demise of the yeast in wine vats once all the sugars have been consumed. I remember my chemistry correctly. On the other hand, personally, Bill never gave up hope. It was funny, you would be talking in class about this fundamental dystopian event. I mean, really what it came down to. But then you talk about personal notes about there is, reason for hope or just because, and he said this many times, just because my academic work shows that there may not be much more for hope, doesn't mean that I have to live my life that way. That as I live my life, I can live it with hope and employ those hopes. I mean, his big thing was moving, I guess, beyond hope. His goal was to push sociology to recognizing that we have to consider all of the ramifications of our lifestyle and the choices we make. One of the few handful of people I know who has totally committed themselves to utilizing mass transit as much as possible. Nope.
This is embarrassing because I've exceeded the carrying capacity of Forum.
Okay.
I have used up more time than we can sustainably have. So I have to awkwardly bring this to a close. So I will thank you for introducing me more deeply to Catton's book, Overshoot. Thank you for being a guest on today's forum. I've been talking with Dr. Todd Rockwood from the Hughes School of Public Health. You can post comments, questions, suggest topics, or guests for future shows on the Affirming Flame Facebook page. That's the Affirming Flame. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kel Heyl.